The sun hung low over the battlefield, casting long shadows over the trampled earth. Dust swirled in thick clouds, kicked up by the movements of thousands of warriors. The plains of Gaul bore witness to a confrontation that would shape history, as the disciplined legions of Rome prepared to face the savage horsemen of Attila the Hun. It was the year 451 AD, and the fate of the Western Roman Empire hung in the balance. Flavius Aetius, Rome's last great general, sat astride his warhorse, surveying the scene. His forces were a patchwork of Roman soldiers, Visigoths under King Theodoric, and various Germanic allies. He knew that unity was fragile among these men, but necessity had bound them together against the common enemy. Across the field, the Huns had formed their own lines, a sea of fast-moving cavalry and fierce warriors from the eastern steppes. They had terrorized Europe for years, and now they had come to claim Gaul for their own. Attila, the scourge of God, watched the Roman lines from a small rise. His dark eyes, shadowed beneath his heavy brow, flickered with the fire of battle. He had brought destruction to countless cities, had crushed the will of emperors, and had turned the might of Rome into trembling fear. But Aetius was different. Aetius understood war in a way few Romans did, and he had assembled a force that could stand against the Huns. Attila respected his enemy, but he did not fear him. The air was thick with the sounds of metal and the distant cries of men. Then, with the blast of a Hun war horn, the battle began. The ground quaked as Attila's cavalry surged forward, their bows loosing a deadly hail of arrows. The Roman front lines braced for impact. Shields locked together in a tight formation. Spears jutted outward, and the first wave of Huns crashed against them with an earth-shaking force. Arrows tore through the sky like a dark storm, striking down men and horses alike. Roman infantry wavered but did not break, their discipline holding firm against the onslaught. On the flanks, the Visigoths countercharged, their own cavalry meeting the Huns in brutal melee. The clash of swords and axes rang out, the screams of the wounded piercing the din of battle. Aetius maneuvered through the chaos, rallying his men. He had fought alongside the Huns in his youth, had learned their ways, and now he used that knowledge against them. He knew that Attila thrived on disorder, so he kept his forces disciplined, forcing the Huns to engage in a prolonged fight. The battle raged for hours, neither side gaining the upper hand. Theodoric, the Visigoth king, fought fiercely but was struck down in the melee. His death nearly shattered his warriors' resolve, but his son, Thorismund, took up the banner, vowing vengeance. Attila, seeing the battle turning against him, ordered his elite warriors to push forward. He needed to break the Roman line to turn order into chaos. He rode at the head of his men, his sword raised high, leading the charge. Aetius saw the move and countered. He sent in his reserves, fresh troops who had been waiting for this moment. The sudden counterattack caught the Huns off guard, their charge losing momentum. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the battle still raged, but it was clear the Huns were faltering. The Visigoths pressed them hard, driving them back toward their camp. Attila, realizing he could not win, retreated behind a defensive circle of wagons. The Romans and their allies surrounded him, but Aetius did not order a final assault. He knew that a cornered Attila was still dangerous. Instead, he allowed the Huns to withdraw, knowing that Rome had won the day. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains was over. Rome had stood firm against the Huns, but the victory was costly. Thousands lay dead, the fields soaked in blood. Theodoric was gone, and the fragile alliance that had held Rome's forces together would soon unravel. Attila lived to fight another day, and the empire's days of dominance were numbered. Yet, for one moment in history, Rome had defied its fate. Aetius had done what few thought possible. He had turned back the tide of destruction. But he knew, deep in his heart, that this was only a temporary reprieve. The world was changing, and Rome, once the unchallenged ruler of civilization, was slowly crumbling. Attila would return, and when he did, the empire would need another miracle to survive. In the days that followed the battle, Aetius faced a new challenge. Though victorious, he had to maintain control over his uneasy allies. The Visigoths, emboldened by their role in the triumph, demanded greater autonomy. The Franks and Burgundians, who had joined Rome's side reluctantly, began pressing for rewards. Aetius knew that Rome could not afford to alienate these factions, but he also understood that keeping them satisfied would be a near impossible task. Meanwhile, Attila retreated across the Rhine, but he did not consider himself defeated. In his camp, his warlords gathered, their faces grim. They had lost a battle, but not the war. Attila's mind worked furiously, plotting his next move. He would not be satisfied until Rome itself lay in ruins. He turned his eyes southward, to Italy. If he could not break the Romans on the battlefield, he would bring destruction to their very heartland. The following year, Attila led his forces across the Alps, striking deep into Roman territory. Cities burned as his hordes swept through the countryside. Aetius, lacking the strength to face him in open battle again, resorted to diplomacy. He sought aid from the Eastern Roman Empire, but they had their own struggles to contend with. Desperate, Aetius turned to Pope Leo I, who personally traveled to meet Attila near the river Pa. What words were exchanged remain a mystery, but remarkably, Attila withdrew. Some say he feared divine retribution. Others believe disease and supply shortages forced his hand. Whatever the reason, Rome was spared. Attila did not live much longer. In 453 AD, he died suddenly, reportedly from a hemorrhage on his wedding night. His empire, built on fear and conquest, crumbled without his leadership. His sons fought among themselves, and the Huns, once an unstoppable force, faded from history. Aetius, however, did not enjoy his triumph for long. In 454 AD, he was assassinated in court by Emperor Valentinian III, who feared his growing power. With Aetius gone, Rome lost its last great defender. The empire staggered on for a few more decades, but the Western Roman Empire would not survive the coming storms. The battle against the Huns had delayed Rome's inevitable fall, but it had not saved it. The tides of history were turning, and soon new powers would rise from the ashes of the empire. Yet, for one moment on the blood-stained fields of Gaul, Rome had stood firm. And that moment, however fleeting, would be remembered for centuries to come.